Welcome back to MadMinds, where history isn't just remembered, it's felt. If this story pulls you in, if it makes you see the world a little differently, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss what comes next. We're building a library of the untold, and if there's a forgotten figure or empire you want us to bring to life, drop it in the comments below. Now, let's return to the ashes of an empire that once called itself eternal. Before the ash, before the fires, before the silence that would swallow the world whole, there was power. Not just the power of armies marching across conquered lands, or gold flowing from distant mines, or laws carved into marble and bronze. This was something far more dangerous, far more intoxicating. The kind of power that could stand on a palace balcony, raise a single hand toward the masses below, and watch an entire empire of 70 million souls hold its breath in terrified anticipation. Rome was not born a kingdom, though it would die as one. It was carved from primordial chaos, by wolves that suckled abandoned twins, by wars that painted the Mediterranean red, and by an iron will that refused to bow before gods or men. For centuries, it stood as a republic of law, order, and controlled bloodshed. Citizens voted, senators debated, and consuls served their terms before stepping down in dignified retirement. But power is a living thing, and it grows hungry with time. It whispers seductive promises in the ears of ambitious men. It does not stay in the hands of the many for long. Eventually, it chooses one man, wraps itself around him like golden chains, and begins the slow, inexorable process of making him a god. The transformation began with Julius Caesar, a man who was not born to purple robes, but who seized them anyway. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, qualities that Rome both admired and feared. When he crossed the Rubicon River with his legions, defying the Senate's direct orders, he didn't just break the law. He shattered the very foundations of the Roman Republic. With that single step into forbidden waters, he transformed Rome from a nation of laws into a stage for his own ambitions. He crowned himself with laurels that had once been reserved for triumphant generals, claimed divine favor from gods who had grown suspiciously silent, and convinced the masses that he wasn't merely another politician grasping for power. He had become Rome itself, its living embodiment, its beating heart, its divine representative on earth. The people cheered his name in the streets, desperate for stability after decades of civil war. The senators, however, watched in growing horror as their carefully constructed system of checks and balances crumbled before their eyes. Their solution was as brutal as it was desperate. 23 knives thrust into Caesar's flesh on the Ides of March, his blood pooling on the marble floor of their sacred meeting place. They thought they were killing a man, but they had failed to understand a crucial truth. Gods do not die easily, and martyrs are far more dangerous than living tyrants. Caesar's assassination didn't restore the Republic. It ignited something far worse. His death created a power vacuum that ambitious men rushed to fill, plunging Rome into another round of devastating civil wars. But from this chaos emerged something unprecedented. His adopted heir, Octavian, who would later take the name Augustus. This young man possessed a cunning that his adoptive father had lacked. Where Caesar had been bold and direct, Augustus was patient and calculating. He took the bones of the broken republic that Caesar had left behind and carefully, methodically, built an empire from them. But he did it so slowly, so cleverly, that most Romans didn't realize what was happening until it was far too late to resist. Augustus kept the familiar trappings of republican government alive like a puppet show, allowing the Senate to continue meeting, citizens to continue voting, and consuls to continue serving, while quietly draining these institutions of any real power. He called himself Princeps, first citizen, a humble title that concealed the absolute authority he had accumulated behind the scenes. By the time the Roman people fully understood what he had accomplished, the transformation was complete. Rome no longer belonged to its citizens or their elected representatives. It belonged entirely to the emperor, a figure who stood above and beyond all mortal authority. What is an emperor, after all, but a king who refuses to acknowledge his own mortality? Augustus and his successors were not content with earthly power alone. They positioned themselves as living gods, divine figures whose statues stood beside Jupiter's in the great temples, whose words could reshape calendars and redraw the borders of nations. They named months after themselves, declared that comets in the night sky were signs of their divine parentage ascending to the heavens, and demanded that their subjects worship them as they would any deity. This was not merely political rule, it had become a religion, complete with priests, rituals, and true believers who would die for their god-emperor's glory. The imperial cult spread throughout the empire like a fever. People prayed to the emperor's image, swore binding oaths in his name, and offered their lives without hesitation when he commanded it. And over time, as generation after generation of rulers basked in this divine worship, something terrible happened. The emperors began to believe their own propaganda. They started to see themselves not as men playing at divinity, but as actual gods temporarily clothed in mortal flesh. This delusion of grandeur would prove to be Rome's undoing, because when mortals believe they are gods, they lose all sense of human limitation and restraint. Not all gods are benevolent protectors who watch over their followers with loving care. Some crave wine that flows like rivers, some thirst for blood that pools in arena sand, and some hunger for fires that consume entire cities. Rome gave birth to a succession of men who looked like divine beings from a distance, beautiful, powerful, draped in gold and purple, but who revealed themselves to be monsters when examined closely. There was Caligula, who elevated his favorite horse to the rank of senator and slaughtered citizens for entertainment at his dinner parties. There was Nero, who played his lyre and sang epic poetry while watching his capital city burn for 6 straight days. And there was Commodus, who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules and spent his time fighting gladiators in the arena while his empire slowly rotted around him. These were not aberrations or temporary lapses in judgment. They were reflections of something deeper and more sinister. They embodied Rome's own bottomless hunger for spectacle, its growing madness born from unchecked power, and its dangerous belief that it could never fall because it had been chosen by the gods themselves for eternal greatness. But when gods go mad, empires inevitably bleed, and Rome was about to discover that even divine favor has its limits. By the time the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, spanning 3 continents and ruling over 70 million souls from Britain to Egypt, it was already beginning to hollow out from within like a tree consumed by invisible rot. Its economy had become completely dependent on an endless supply of slaves captured in foreign wars. Its military strength relied on constant expansion and conquest to pay for itself. Its culture had drowned in decadence and spectacle, losing sight of the simple virtues that had once made Rome great. But none of these warning signs seemed to matter to those in power, because the emperors still ruled from their marble palaces, and the people still believed in the myth of Roman invincibility. The Colosseum continued to thunder with the roars of 50,000 spectators demanding blood. The great temples still burned with clouds of expensive incense offered to increasingly silent gods. The Senate still gathered for their meaningless meetings, but only to nod their approval of whatever the emperor had already decided. Rome had become a magnificent machine built from marble columns and beautiful illusions, glorious and awe-inspiring when viewed from a distance, but cracked and crumbling when examined up close. Because power, no matter how absolute it appears, cannot hold empires together forever, not when the gods begin to show signs of madness, not when the emperors stop pretending to care about their subjects' welfare, not when the people slowly begin to forget what it once felt like to be free citizens rather than obedient subjects. Rome was no longer a republic of laws and civic virtue. It was no longer even a city that happened to rule an empire. It had transformed into something far more dangerous, a god made manifest in marble and gold, a wounded god, a beautiful god, a god that demanded worship even as it showed every sign of approaching death. And somewhere deep beneath its golden palaces and silk-draped chambers, beneath the blood-slick stones of its arena floors, beneath the lies that had been carved into history itself and presented as eternal truth, something fundamental began to rot. The decay was invisible at first, hidden beneath layers of wealth and ceremony, but it was spreading like poison through the empire's veins, and soon nothing would be able to stop its progress toward inevitable collapse. There is a special kind of fear that lives only in the corridors of absolute power, behind doors guarded by men who have sworn unbreakable oaths of loyalty. It is not the fear of enemy armies massing at distant borders, nor even the fear of death itself, which comes to all mortals regardless of their wealth or status. This is something far more insidious and corrosive, the fear of being constantly watched by the very people who smile when you enter the room, who bow deeply when you pass, but who spend their private moments counting the minutes until you never walk back out again. That atmosphere of barely controlled terror and paranoid suspicion had become the defining characteristic of imperial Rome by the 2nd century. The empire had transformed itself into a grand theater where every interaction was a carefully rehearsed performance. The emperor played the role of a divine ruler dispensing wisdom and justice, while everyone around him performed the parts of loyal subjects and devoted servants. But beneath these elaborate costumes and scripted dialogues, a far more deadly drama was unfolding. The throne had become a trap, and the purple robe that marked supreme authority had also become a target that could be seen from every shadowy corner of the palace. In the marble halls where Caesar had once walked as a conquering hero, power was no longer passed down through orderly succession or democratic election. It was seized through carefully planned assassinations, stolen with poison slipped into wine cups, and transferred through whispered conspiracies that moved faster than the empire's famous legions. The same Senate that had once gathered the courage to plant 23 daggers in Caesar's chest now bowed subserviently before emperors they secretly despised and sometimes murdered in their sleep. The Praetorian Guard, originally created to protect the emperor's life, had become the greatest threat to his survival, selling their loyalty to the highest bidder and auctioning the throne itself like a piece of valuable property. By the 2nd century after Christ, Roman emperors had stopped dying of old age or natural illness. Instead, they met their ends in bedchambers where trusted servants became assassins, in marble baths where the water turned red with blood, and at elaborate banquets where they smiled and laughed in the evening but choked on poison before dawn. The imperial palace had become a killing ground where every corridor might conceal a knife, every meal might contain a deadly herb, and every friendly face might mask murderous intentions. The madness began in earnest with Caligula, born into the imperial family and raised surrounded by the intoxicating rituals of absolute power. When he first took the throne, he was genuinely loved by the Roman people. He was young, handsome, and carried the bloodline of respected military commanders. Citizens wept tears of joy in the streets, convinced that their empire had finally found a worthy leader. But then something inside him broke, perhaps under the weight of expectations that no mortal man could bear, perhaps from breathing the poisonous air of a court where everyone lied and no one could be trusted. Caligula declared himself a living god and demanded that senators crawl across the floor to kiss his feet. He ordered Roman soldiers to march to the seashore and collect seashells as spoils of war, then declared victory over Neptune himself. He held elaborate orgies in the palace, involving the wives and daughters of Rome's most prominent families, then had many of the participants executed the following morning for his entertainment. He appointed his favorite horse as a consul, forcing the Senate to treat the animal as if it were a respected colleague. Rome had become his personal circus, and its citizens were merely animals performing for his amusement. His own guards, men who had sworn sacred oaths to protect his life, eventually reached their breaking point. Humiliated, terrified, and disgusted by the depths of his cruelty, they cornered him in a palace hallway and stabbed him to death. There was no trial, no ceremony, no formal transfer of power, just sudden violence followed by an even more disturbing silence. The Senate cheered his death, but the empire itself barely seemed to notice that one god emperor had been replaced by another. Rome had become so accustomed to madness that sanity was no longer required, only the continuation of familiar routines. When one emperor fell, another inevitably rose to take his place, like heads sprouting from the neck of some mythical hydra. Some of the new rulers genuinely attempted to restore order and govern wisely. Others proved to be even worse than their predecessors. Nero inherited the throne as a teenager and initially showed promise, guided by capable advisors who tried to teach him the responsibilities of leadership. But power corrupted him just as it had corrupted so many others, and his reign descended into a nightmare of artistic pretension and casual brutality. Rome burned during his rule, 6 days and nights of uncontrolled fire that reduced entire neighborhoods to ash and rubble. While his subjects fled in panic through smoke-filled streets, Nero watched the conflagration from his palace windows, strumming a lyre and singing epic verses about the fall of Troy. When the flames finally died down, he blamed the growing Christian community for the disaster, using them as scapegoats to deflect attention from his own failures as a leader. He had Christians torn apart by wild animals in the arena for the entertainment of the masses, and used their burning bodies as human torches to illuminate his private garden parties. But even madness has limits, and even the most tolerant population eventually reaches its breaking point. The Senate finally turned against him, the people rioted in the streets, and his own armies declared him a traitor to Rome itself. Facing the prospect of capture and public execution, Nero took his own life with a dagger, whispering his final words, "What an artist dies in me." He saw himself as a misunderstood genius rather than a tyrant, a tragic figure whose creative vision had been rejected by a world too crude to appreciate his artistic gifts. The madness didn't die with Nero. It had become endemic to the imperial system itself, spreading like a contagious disease through every level of Roman society. The palace had become a revolving door where emperors entered with grand ambitions and exited as corpses. One ruler managed to hold power for only 2 years before being assassinated. Another lasted 3 months before meeting a violent end. One particularly unlucky emperor ruled for exactly 9 days before being strangled in his sleep by men he had trusted with his life. The Praetorian Guard, originally established as an elite unit sworn to protect the emperor's person, had gradually transformed into Rome's most dangerous enemy. These soldiers, who stood closest to absolute power, began to see themselves as kingmakers who could create and destroy emperors at will. They literally auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder on multiple occasions, selling the governance of the world's greatest empire like livestock at a market. Rome, which had once been sacred and inviolable, had become a commodity to be purchased by anyone with sufficient gold. And yet, despite this horrific cycle of violence and corruption, the empire itself continued to function and even expand its borders. The reason was simple. The administrative machine that Augustus had created was so efficient and self-sustaining that it could operate almost independently of whoever happened to be sitting on the throne. Grain shipments still flowed from the rich farmlands of Egypt to feed the masses in the capital. Gold and silver still poured in from mines in Spain and other provinces. Armies of slaves continued to harvest crops, extract precious metals, and construct the monuments that proclaimed Rome's eternal greatness to the world. The mob in Rome's crowded neighborhoods still demanded their daily ration of free bread, and the emperors still provided spectacular gladiatorial games to keep them distracted from their political powerlessness. In the Colosseum, condemned criminals were fed to exotic beasts imported from Africa, while 50,000 spectators screamed their approval. Trained fighters battled to the death with swords and spears, while the crowd decided their fate with upturned or downturned thumbs. Blood flowed like water across the arena sand, and everyone pretended that this endless cycle of violence was normal, even admirable. All the while, the empire continued its relentless expansion, swallowing new territories and peoples with mechanical efficiency. But Rome was rotting from within, poisoned by its own success and corrupted by power that recognized no limits or restraints. By the 3rd century, the contradictions had become impossible to ignore. The empire had split like a cracked marble statue, unable to bear its own weight any longer. Multiple men claimed the title of emperor simultaneously, each controlling different regions and insisting that he alone held legitimate authority. Some ruled from Rome, others established rival capitals in distant provinces, and military commanders declared themselves Caesar wherever they happened to be stationed. Generals proclaimed their own imperial dignity to their troops, who switched their allegiance not for honor or patriotism, but for whoever could pay them the most gold. The emperors who remained in Rome, struggling to maintain control over this fragmenting colossus, stopped trusting anyone around them. They could no longer rely on the Senate, which had become a decorative institution without real power. They suspected their own generals of harboring treasonous ambitions. They even began to fear members of their own families, seeing potential rivals and assassins in every brother, wife, or child who might someday challenge their authority. Some emperors resolved these paranoid suspicions by murdering their own relatives in preemptive strikes against imagined threats. Brothers were poisoned at family dinners. Wives were stabbed while they slept. Sons were strangled by their own fathers to prevent potential coups. The imperial palace had become a tomb where trust was impossible, and survival required constant vigilance against those who should have been closest allies. Every corridor in the palace held the potential for sudden death. Every shadow might conceal an assassin's blade. Every meal might be seasoned with poison. Every friendly conversation might be a prelude to betrayal. The throne, which had once symbolized the pinnacle of human achievement and divine favor, had literally become a grave that consumed everyone who dared to occupy it. But power is the most addictive drug ever created by human ambition. Despite knowing the almost certain fate that awaited them, men continued to fight for the right to wear the purple robe and sit on the blood-stained throne. Rome kept swallowing its own blood, consuming its own children, sacrificing its own future, all while desperately hoping that the gods would still protect an empire that had long since forgotten how to protect itself. The gods, however, had grown silent. Their temples still received expensive offerings, their statues still gleamed with gold and precious stones, but they no longer seemed to answer the prayers of their worshippers. And the Roman people, once so confident in their divine destiny, began to watch their rulers with growing detachment. They cheered when expected, wept when appropriate, and continued to attend the games and festivals that marked the rhythm of imperial life. But underneath their public displays of loyalty, doubt had begun to take root. The empire continued its forward momentum like a massive stone rolling down a mountainside, not because it was guided by wisdom or sustained by faith, but simply because it was too large and too heavy to stop. But momentum alone cannot prevent decay, and deep inside the heart of the Roman world, something fundamental had begun to pull apart, not through war or natural disaster, but through the slow, inexorable erosion of belief itself. The fall of an empire should announce itself with dramatic flourishes: the clash of armies at crucial battles, the sight of enemy banners planted on conquered walls, the sound of foreign voices proclaiming victory in the streets of a defeated capital. But Rome's collapse was far more subtle and therefore far more terrifying. It rotted slowly from within, like fruit left too long in the sun, beautiful on the surface but corrupt at the core. There was no single enemy that Rome could face in decisive combat. There was no great war that would determine the empire's fate in an afternoon of heroic struggle. Instead, there was only pressure, constant, grinding, inexorable pressure from a dozen different directions at once. The weight of governing an empire that had grown too large for any single mind to comprehend. The burden of maintaining loyalty among subjects who had never chosen to be conquered. The impossible task of defending borders that stretched across 3 continents and touched every known sea. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire had become like a giant, slowly consuming its own flesh to survive. In the span of 50 years, 26 different men claimed the title of emperor, and most of them did not die peacefully in their beds surrounded by grieving families. Most did not even rule alone. Rival claimants emerged constantly, like mushrooms sprouting after rain, each gathering armies and declaring himself the true heir to Caesar's legacy. One emperor might control the eastern provinces while another dominated the west. A third would declare his independence along the Rhine frontier, and a fourth would establish his capital in some distant city that had never before harbored imperial ambitions. Military commanders crowned themselves with whatever ceremony they could arrange. Governors hoarded tax revenues instead of sending them to Rome, and entire legions switched their loyalty based not on honor or patriotism, but on whoever could offer them the most immediate rewards. And Rome itself, The ancient heart of this crumbling empire had grown too exhausted to care about these distant power struggles. The city's residents were more concerned with securing their daily ration of free bread than with the political chaos that was tearing their world apart. The Senate still gathered for their meetings, but they had long since abandoned any pretense of governing. They simply endorsed whatever the current emperor demanded, knowing that tomorrow might bring a new ruler with completely different policies. Meanwhile, death stalked the empire in forms that no army could fight and no amount of gold could bribe. Disease swept across the provinces like an invisible enemy, more devastating than any barbarian invasion. The Antonine Plague struck first, followed decades later by the even more terrible Plague of Cyprian. Both epidemics moved through the empire's cities and towns like fire-consuming dry grass. Bodies piled up in the courtyards of temples that had been hastily converted into makeshift morgues. The streets filled with smoke from funeral pyres that burned day and night for months. Entire families vanished, leaving behind empty houses that no one dared to enter. People abandoned their cities, their communities, their long-held beliefs about the gods' protection. Some concluded that the deities were angry and required more elaborate sacrifices to appease their wrath. Others began to suspect that the gods had simply abandoned Rome to its fate, leaving mortals to face their destiny alone. And still, incredibly, the emperors continued to perform their ancient rituals of divinity. They still claimed to be living gods, even as their subjects died by the thousands around them. They still promised divine protection to people who could see with their own eyes that no such protection existed. They still demanded worship from citizens who were too busy burying their families to attend religious ceremonies. The empire's economy, which had once seemed as solid and permanent as the marble columns that supported great buildings, began to show dangerous cracks. The grain fleets from Egypt, which fed the population of Rome itself, arrived late or not at all, disrupted by pirates, storms, and the simple breakdown of administrative efficiency. The famous Roman roads, once maintained with obsessive care, fell into disrepair as local officials diverted funds to more immediate concerns. Provincial governors imposed crushing taxes on their territories, squeezing every possible coin from populations that were already struggling to survive. To finance the empire's endless appetite for gold and silver, the imperial mints began producing debased currency, mixing precious metals with cheaper tin and copper. The result was predictable. Inflation spiraled out of control as people lost faith in money that was obviously worthless. A simple loaf of bread began to cost what a soldier had once earned in a month. Citizens returned to bartering goods and services directly, as if the empire had somehow reversed the progress of centuries and returned to more primitive economic systems. When traditional sources of revenue proved insufficient, the emperors turned to increasingly desperate measures. They confiscated property from wealthy families on trumped-up charges of treason. They sold government positions to the highest bidders, regardless of competence or honesty. They devalued the currency again and again, creating a vicious cycle where each new debasement made the empire's financial problems worse rather than better. The economy collapsed under this combination of plague, corruption, and fiscal irresponsibility, and with it collapsed the loyalty that had once held the empire together. Because Rome, for all its talk of patriotism and civic virtue, had never really been built on idealistic devotion to abstract principles. It had been constructed on a foundation of mutual self-interest, held together by an intricate web of bribes, rewards, and carefully calculated benefits that made cooperation more profitable than rebellion. When those benefits disappeared, when service to Rome no longer guaranteed prosperity, when loyalty to the emperor no longer ensured protection, when Roman citizenship no longer provided meaningful advantages, the entire system began to unravel with terrifying speed. So the emperors, faced with the loss of their subjects' willing cooperation, increasingly resorted to naked force and intimidation. They created new laws with harsher punishments for even minor acts of disobedience. They established new categories of crimes that could be punished with death, slavery, or exile. They attempted to control their subjects' religious beliefs as well as their political behavior, demanding public displays of loyalty to the traditional gods as proof of continued allegiance to the imperial system. One emperor, Decius, required every citizen throughout the empire to participate in public sacrifices to the Roman pantheon or face execution as a traitor. Another, Diocletian, tried to solve the problem of imperial overstretch by dividing authority among four different rulers, each responsible for a different region of the empire. This administrative reform worked temporarily, but it also multiplied the opportunities for corruption and power struggles, creating four potential sources of civil war instead of one. The Senate, which had once been Rome's most prestigious deliberative body, had degenerated into pure theater. Senators attended meetings where they applauded speeches they hadn't written, endorsed policies they didn't understand, and voted for measures they knew would never be implemented. The army had become a king-making institution whose primary loyalty was to whoever could afford to pay them the most. And the Roman people themselves had simply stopped believing in the myths and promises that had once sustained their civilization. Not just in the emperors, who were obviously corrupt and incompetent. Not just in the Senate, which had become a meaningless ceremonial institution. Not just in the gods, who seemed to have abandoned their chosen people, but in Rome itself, in the very idea that their empire represented something special and eternal in human history. The old gods of Rome gradually faded from active worship, replaced by exotic mystery religions imported from the eastern provinces, Mithras, a Persian deity popular among soldiers, Isis, an Egyptian goddess who promised resurrection after death, Cybele, the Great Mother whose priests castrated themselves in ecstatic religious ceremonies, and increasingly Christianity, not yet the official religion of the empire, but growing steadily in influence despite periodic persecutions. These new faiths offered something that the traditional Roman pantheon had stopped providing: hope. Hope for life after death, hope for divine justice that would correct earthly wrongs, hope for a God who actually cared about individual human suffering rather than demanding endless sacrifices while remaining mysteriously silent. The Christian message of one God, loving rather than vengeful, offering salvation to all believers regardless of their social status, proved particularly attractive to people who had watched their empire's traditional gods fail to protect them from plague, poverty, and political chaos. Rome's rulers recognized the threat that Christianity posed to their authority and attempted to suppress it through increasingly violent persecutions. They crucified Christian leaders, fed believers to wild animals in the arena, and used their burning bodies as torches to illuminate public spectacles. But the more brutally they tried to crush this new faith, the more attractive it became to people who were desperate for an alternative to the empire's obvious moral bankruptcy. The real danger to Rome's survival wasn't military or economic, it was spiritual. The empire's greatest strength had never been its legions or its gold, but rather the widespread belief among its subjects that Roman rule represented the natural order of the world, blessed by the gods and destined to last forever. When that belief crumbled, when people stopped trusting in Rome's divine mandate and began looking elsewhere for meaning and hope, the empire's political and military structures became irrelevant. It didn't matter how many soldiers guarded the borders if the people inside those borders no longer wanted to be Romans. It didn't matter how much tax revenue flowed into the imperial treasury if the taxpayers had lost faith in the system they were supporting. It didn't matter how impressive the buildings looked or how elaborate the ceremonies were if everyone could see that the empire was rotting from within. And that's when the walls truly began to shake, not from external pressure, but from internal abandonment. Entire regions simply stopped sending their required tribute to Rome. Villages and towns ceased to obey imperial edicts, governing themselves according to local customs and needs. Border outposts were abandoned overnight by soldiers who decided they had better prospects elsewhere. Tax collectors found themselves facing hostile populations who refused to cooperate with demands they considered illegitimate. The empire hadn't been conquered by foreign enemies, but it was certainly falling apart. It was disintegrating from within as millions of people simultaneously made the individual decision that Rome was no longer worth supporting, defending, or preserving. The center could not hold because the center had lost its moral authority, and without that authority, all the legions and all the gold in the world could not keep an empire together. The great gates of Rome were not shattered by enemy siege engines or consumed by revolutionary fires. They were opened quietly, almost politely, by people who had simply decided that the empire was already dead. By the time the barbarians arrived at Rome's borders, they found an empire that had already defeated itself through corruption, madness, and the slow erosion of belief. The city that had once claimed to rule the world was now defended by men who no longer believed in what they were fighting for. For centuries, Rome had dismissed the Germanic tribes beyond its northern borders as barbarians, a contemptuous term that meant anyone who wasn't Roman, anyone who spoke differently, worshipped strange gods, or organized their society according to unfamiliar customs. But these so-called barbarians weren't the savage primitives that Roman propaganda had portrayed. They were desperate refugees, fleeing westward in terror from something even more frightening than the collapse of civilization itself. That terror had a name: Attila the Hun, called the Scourge of God by those who survived encounters with his armies. Attila was a man who believed with absolute certainty that he had been chosen by destiny to consume the world, to sweep away every existing order and replace it with something entirely new and terrible. His mounted warriors moved across the landscape like supernatural beings, faster than any conventional army, silent until the moment they struck, utterly ruthless in their destruction of everything that stood in their path. The Huns didn't fight wars in the traditional sense. They ended them before they could properly begin. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished overnight, leaving behind only scorched foundations and scattered bones. Entire peoples abandoned their ancestral lands and fled westward, carrying nothing but desperate stories of unstoppable horsemen who appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly, leaving behind landscapes that looked as though they had been scraped clean by the hand of an angry god. The Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and dozens of smaller peoples, found themselves caught between annihilation at the hands of the Huns and the heavily defended borders of an empire that had spent centuries treating them as enemies. In their desperation, they turned to Rome not as conquerors, but as supplicants, begging for refuge within the empire's borders, offering to serve as auxiliary soldiers in exchange for land and protection. Rome, weakened by plague and civil war, but still maintaining the pretense of strength, agreed to accept some of these refugees. But the empire treated its new barbarian allies with the same mixture of arrogance and exploitation that had characterized its relationships with subject peoples for centuries. Roman officials starved the refugees, abused their families, imposed crushing taxes on people who had nothing left to give, and generally made it clear that barbarians would never be considered equal to true Romans, no matter how loyally they served imperial interests. The inevitable result was rebellion. In 378 AD, something happened that shocked the Roman world more than any previous military defeat. At the Battle of Adrianople, Roman legions, the same legions that had conquered most of the known world, were completely annihilated by an army of barbarian foederati who had supposedly been allies just months earlier. The Emperor Valens himself was killed in the fighting, burned alive in a peasant's hut where he had sought refuge from the slaughter. His body never recovered from the smoking ruins. This wasn't just another military setback that could be reversed with better tactics or additional reinforcements. It was a revelation that shattered fundamental assumptions about Roman invincibility. For the first time in centuries, a Roman army had been utterly destroyed by an enemy that Rome itself had created through its own short-sighted policies and casual cruelties. The gods who were supposed to protect the chosen people had remained silent while barbarian swords cut down Roman eagles. The empire limped onward for several more decades, trying desperately to manage the crisis through a combination of military force and diplomatic compromise. Roman administrators offered barbarian chieftains official titles and positions within the imperial hierarchy, hoping to co-opt them into the existing system rather than fighting them as open enemies. They granted land to entire tribes in exchange for military service, essentially allowing foreign peoples to settle permanently within the empire's borders as autonomous communities. But Rome was no longer Roman in any meaningful sense, and the barbarians who accepted these offers understood that better than the Romans themselves did. They took the titles and the land and the promises of partnership, but they never forgot that they were dealing with an empire that had already demonstrated its fundamental weakness and moral bankruptcy. In 410 AD, the unthinkable finally happened. The Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, marched directly on Rome itself, the eternal city that had not been touched by enemy hands for 800 years. The Senate begged for mercy, the emperor fled to a more defensible location, and the city's gates were opened without resistance. There was no heroic last stand, no dramatic siege, no final battle between the forces of civilization and barbarism. Rome simply surrendered to an army of refugees whom it had betrayed and brutalized. For 3 days, the Visigoths methodically looted the capital of the world. They carried away centuries of accumulated treasure, desecrated temples whose gods had stopped protecting their worshippers, and shattered statues of emperors who had claimed divine authority. But significantly, they didn't burn the city or massacre its population. They didn't need to destroy Rome because Rome had already destroyed itself. The sack was more like a funeral than a military conquest, a formal acknowledgement that something great had died and was now ready for burial. As news of Rome's fall spread throughout the Mediterranean world, it sent shockwaves that reached every corner of the known world. People who had grown up believing that Roman rule was as permanent and unchangeable as the movement of the stars suddenly faced the reality that empires, no matter how powerful they appear, are as mortal as the men who build them. If Rome could fall, then nothing in the world was secure. If the eternal city could be sacked by barbarians, then the very concept of civilization was more fragile than anyone had dared to imagine. But there was no one left in Rome with the authority or the ability to respond effectively to this existential crisis. The western provinces of the empire were breaking away, declaring their independence, or simply ignoring orders from a capital that could no longer protect them. Armies were deserting en masse, taking their weapons and equipment with them to serve local strongmen who could actually pay their wages. Cities throughout the empire were refusing to send tax revenue to Rome, choosing instead to keep their wealth for local defense against the chaos that was spreading like wildfire across the known world. At the center of this collapse sat a boy, the final, tragic symbol of what Rome had become. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire would bear the name Romulus Augustulus, a cruel historical joke that combined the names of Rome's mythical founder with its first divine emperor. But there was nothing mythical or divine about this final ruler. He was a child, barely old enough to understand the weight of the crown that others had placed on his head, too young to comprehend that he was presiding over the death of a civilization that had lasted for over 1,000 years. Romulus Augustulus was not a tyrant drunk on power or a madman who believed himself to be a god. He wasn't even truly a man. He was simply a frightened boy caught in the machinery of an empire that had already stopped functioning. He had no real authority, no loyal armies, no treasury to draw upon, and no advisors who could offer realistic solutions to problems that had grown far beyond any individual's ability to solve. He was a puppet emperor ruling over a puppet empire, maintained by people who were going through the motions of governance while the world crumbled around them. In 476 AD, a barbarian general named Odoacer walked into the imperial palace without encountering any meaningful resistance. He didn't need to bring an army because there was no one left to fight him. He simply informed the Senate that there would be no more emperors in the Western Roman Empire, that the boy's reign was over, and that Rome as a political entity was finished. The senators handed him the imperial regalia, the purple robes, the golden scepter, the eagle standards that had once led legions to victory across 3 continents, and arranged to send these symbols of power to Constantinople, as if they were returning borrowed items that no longer belonged in the West. There was no final battle, no dramatic speeches about honor and glory, no last desperate attempt to preserve what had once been the greatest empire in human history. Just a courier carrying a package across the Mediterranean, delivering the news that Rome had quietly ceased to exist. 1,000 years of imperial history reduced to a bureaucratic formality, an administrative transfer that marked the end of an era with the same mundane efficiency that had once characterized the empire's greatest achievements. And what became of the boy emperor, the last person to wear the title that had once made men into gods? He was spared the violent death that had claimed so many of his predecessors. Odoacer, perhaps recognizing that there was no point in martyring a child who posed no real threat to anyone, simply sent him away to live in quiet exile, somewhere far from the centers of power. History loses track of Romulus Augustulus after that moment, and he disappears into the silence that was already swallowing so much of what Rome had been. The last emperor of Rome left no final words for posterity, no carved epitaph to mark his passing, no ashes scattered in some sacred place to commemorate his role in one of history's greatest dramas. He simply vanished, becoming just another casualty of an empire that had forgotten how to preserve anything, including its own memory. His disappearance was perhaps the most fitting end possible for a civilization that was itself disappearing into legend and myth. But Rome did not vanish overnight like a city consumed by earthquake or fire. The physical infrastructure of the empire, its roads, aqueducts, buildings, and monuments, remained standing for centuries after the last emperor departed. The legal codes that Roman jurists had spent centuries developing continued to influence how people resolved disputes and organized their communities. Latin, the language of the empire, evolved into the Romance languages that millions of people still speak today. The architectural principles that Roman engineers had perfected continued to guide construction projects throughout Europe and beyond. Most importantly, the idea of Rome, the dream of a unified civilization governed by law rather than caprice, protected by professional armies rather than tribal militias, and blessed by divine favor rather than dependent on mere human effort, survived long after the political reality had crumbled into dust. Future kings would claim to be the heirs of Caesar, future empires would model themselves on Roman precedents, and future peoples would look back on Rome as the lost golden age that they hoped to restore through their own efforts. But the beating heart of Rome, the living center that had transformed a small Italian city-state into the ruler of the known world, died in 476 AD with barely a whisper of protest. The empire hadn't been built on stone and steel alone. It had been constructed from belief, sustained by faith, and held together by the shared conviction that Rome represented something eternal and sacred in human affairs. When that belief finally crumbled under the weight of corruption, madness, and betrayal, the physical structures became merely monuments to a dead civilization, impressive ruins that testified to vanished greatness. Historians have spent centuries debating the exact date when Rome truly fell, and they may continue that debate for centuries more. Some point to 476 AD and the deposition of Romulus Augustulus as the definitive end. Others argue that the Eastern Roman Empire, which survived as the Byzantine Empire for nearly another 1,000 years, represented the continuation of Roman civilization in a different form. Still others contend that Rome never really fell at all, but simply transformed itself into the Catholic Church, which preserved Roman law, Latin language, and imperial administrative methods under a different kind of authority. But these academic disputes miss the more fundamental truth about how civilizations actually die. Empires don't collapse in a single day, marked by dramatic battles and formal surrender ceremonies. They decay gradually, almost imperceptibly, like organisms succumbing to a disease that attacks their vital organs while leaving their outer appearance relatively unchanged. Rome fell not when barbarian armies breached its gates, but when its people stopped believing that being Roman meant anything special or valuable. The collapse began with small acts of betrayal and abandonment that seemed insignificant at the time. A tax collector who pocketed imperial revenue instead of sending it to the capital, a governor who ignored orders from Rome and ruled his province according to local interests, a general who switched sides during a civil war for personal advantage rather than principle, a priest who stopped believing that the emperor was actually divine, a citizen who decided that Roman law was less important than tribal custom. Each individual act of disloyalty weakened the bonds that held the empire together, but no single betrayal was dramatic enough to attract widespread attention or provoke immediate consequences. The damage accumulated slowly, like water seeping through tiny cracks in a foundation, until the entire structure becomes unstable. By the time the problems became visible to everyone, it was far too late to repair the damage through conventional political or military means. Rome died when its people stopped remembering why it had mattered in the first place. It died when the stories that had once inspired loyalty and sacrifice began to sound like empty propaganda. It died when the rituals that had once connected citizens to something larger than themselves became meaningless ceremonies performed out of habit rather than conviction. It died when the gods stopped listening and the people stopped caring whether they listened or not. The final truth about the fall of Rome is that it wasn't conquered by superior enemies or destroyed by natural disasters. It committed suicide through 1,000 small acts of selfishness, corruption, and spiritual emptiness. It killed itself by forgetting that civilizations, like people, must have some purpose higher than mere survival if they want to remain worth preserving. And so Rome died not with the dramatic flourish that its greatest poets might have composed, but with the quiet sigh that marks the end of all things that have outlived their time. Its last flame wasn't a war or a plague or a siege. It was the simple, terrible act of forgetting. Forgetting why laws matter more than force. Forgetting why truth matters more than convenience. Forgetting why some things are worth dying for and others are worth living for, because that is how all empires fall in the end. Not when they are conquered by external enemies who prove themselves stronger or more determined, but when they have already surrendered from within and simply don't realize it yet. They fall when they stop believing in themselves, stop trusting their own principles, and stop caring whether future generations will remember them as something noble or merely as another pile of impressive ruins slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather. Rome's greatest achievement was not its armies or its buildings or its laws, but its ability to convince millions of people from dozens of different cultures that they were all part of something magnificent and eternal. Its greatest failure was losing that ability, allowing the shared dream of Roman citizenship to dissolve into the nightmare of imperial tyranny. And its most lasting legacy is the reminder that no human institution, no matter how powerful it appears or how permanent it seems, can survive the loss of the beliefs that brought it into existence and sustained it through its greatest triumphs. The empire that had once believed it could never fall discovered in the end that it had been falling all along. It just took 1,000 years for gravity to finish its work.